Hi, everybody. This is Mrs. McManus, and I want to do a quick screencast for you discussing chronology that historians use and prehistoric age classification, which will just be helpful when I say these terms during class for you to really understand what it's all about. So, to begin with, when we talk about chronology in history, particularly ancient, like really ancient history, it can be a little bit tricky because there are a lot of terms that are being used. So, for example, you may have heard the term BC or the term AD. So, BC is a little bit outdated, to be honest. Originally, when these were created, it sort of was that the year zero was the year that Jesus of Nazareth was born, and therefore everything that came before was before Christ, and everything that came after it was Latin Anno Domini, which means the year of our Lord. But clearly that's very religious, and although historians who coined it were religious, today we like to be a little bit more politically correct. And so you'll see that I usually reference them as BCE, which now stands for before the Common Era, and CE, which stands for the Common Era. If you use BC or AD, though, I won't fault you for it because you'll see sometimes in readings those might still be used, but for the most part, people are starting to switch over. So this just sort of is a nice graphic that I found that shows that, of course, BC and AD are Christian, whereas secular is the BCE and the CE. Now, when we talk about chronology and we're talking about centuries, as you know, a century is 100 years. I'm actually going to go back a slide real quick. If you look, for example, on the BC side over here, you'll see that it goes backwards. It starts at 0 and goes 500, 1,000, 1,500. Whereas on the CE side, it goes 500, 1,000, 1,500, and so on. And so it can be a little confusing. When I'm talking about the 3rd century BCE, I'm not actually talking about the 300s BCE. I'm actually talking about the 200s BCE. So what is actually a little bit easy to do is what I figured out is on the CE side, when we're talking that we live in the 21st century, we live in 2019. Our century doesn't begin with 21. So you take 21st century and minus 100, and that's what the century that we're actually talking about. And it would be the opposite for the BCE side. So, for example, if we have 20th century CE, I'm really talking about the 1900s, 15th century, the 1400s, and so on. Even where it gets a little bit confusing is the 1st century CE is the year 0 to 99, and the 1st century BCE is also the year 0 to 99, but it just goes backwards. And then again, you'll see that the 8th century BCE is the 700s. So again, in BCE, always subtract 1, and that's the actual years that we're talking about. So this is a little activity for you to pause at this point and to see if you can connect the year to the century. The more you see it and the more you practice, the easier it will be. Some of you are like, oh yeah, I love ancient history. I already know all this stuff, but some people don't. So I just wanted to make sure to go over a quick overview. So when we're talking about prehistoric ages, when we say prehistoric, or you sometimes hear historians call this protohistoric, it's really because we're talking about before written history. So written history, some of the first real written histories were probably in the years 550 BCE. This would have been the time of the ancient Greeks, and there was a really famous historian slash writer named Herodotus. And so we typically say that history kind of starts around that time. I'm going to say kinda and circa and approximately a lot in this presentation because these are all approximations. There is definitely nothing is set in stone. Actually, there are records set in stone, but you know what I mean. The dates themselves are not set in stone. The ancient people surely did not use these dates for sure. So this is called the three-age system, and this was actually pioneered by a historian in the 19th century CE, so we're talking the 1800s, and basically it says that there are 3 ages of prehistory. And because there are no written records, you might be like, well, how do we figure out what these stages are? Basically, they've decided to take each of these ages and assign it based on the archaeological stuff that they've found. So during the Iron Age, for example, they have found more tools and weapons made of iron. During Bronze Age, they were made of bronze. During Stone Age, they were made of stone. I think you can get it. Right? And so these subdivisions can be further subdivided, but they kind of help us sort of see where humans were at each given period of time. So if we look at the Stone Age, there's actually 3 different periods of the Stone Age. This period from about 2.5 million years ago to about 3300 BCE is also known as the Old Stone Age. And so they think that the Old Stone Age probably, the Paleolithic period of the Stone Age potentially actually stopped at about 9600 BCE. So, I mean, this isn't to scale, but, roughly around here-ish. And that was because that was the end of the last ice age. And this is, of course, the last big ice age. Believe it or not, maybe you already know this, there have actually been in history several mini ice ages, but we're talking the big last ice age. Then, still part of the Stone Age, still using stone tools, is the Mesolithic, kind of like the middle period of the Stone Age. And this starts to be around when agriculture starts. So archaeologists are actually finding a lot more agricultural tools that are made out of stone. And so this is going to vary depending on the region. So, for example, this started way earlier in the Middle East because we know the Fertile Crescent. That is potentially where the agricultural revolution started, as far as we know. But then it took years to spread to other areas. So Britain, for example, wouldn't have barely been in this period of the Stone Age until maybe about 4000 BCE is when they actually think that agriculture starts. And when we say agriculture, I'll be having you do a homework assignment that talks way more about this, but we mean people settling down to plant and grow their food. Now, during the Neolithic period of the Stone Age, again, still stone tools, but what you start to see is that there's animal domestication happening during this time. So they are taking cattle, they're taking goats, other animals, and instead of having them, roam free and following the herds like they might have previously, they're actually domesticating them and sort of herding them in and settling them in their area. This again is going to start approximately, that's what the little tilde, the squiggly line is approximate. Roughly, again, in the Middle East, it would have been earlier, around 9000 BCE, spreading all the way to 6000 BC in Asia. Now, of note is that copper metallurgy actually does start near the end of this period, but really we don't see massive uses of copper at this point. The Bronze Age is when we do. So humans had actually, like I said, started smelting that copper in the previous age, although some did later, like again, Britain, way later. They didn't start until 1900 BCE. So bronze is an alloy of tin and copper, and they found that it was actually pretty easy to smelt. And so copper was originally used for small and precious objects. I'm thinking jewelry, I'm thinking religious objects perhaps, but by 3000 BCE, really the use of it was widespread. And they started to cast the bronze for tools and for weapons, and it was really strong and in some cases stronger than most types of stone. Some historians and archaeologists think that this may have been the reason why Mesopotamia urbanized, as they started needing settled places to smelt the bronze, or I should say the tin and the copper together to make bronze. And then the last of these ages is the Iron Age. This is when you start to see the smelting of iron, and it's going to replace bronze. And it's going to be used for not only weaponry, though, but it's going to be used for tools, roughly around 1200 BCE. They think that it began in the Middle East and Southeastern Europe again, but it, interestingly enough, didn't hit China until years later in 600 BCE. Humans, again, probably had started smelting iron during the Bronze Age, but it really, again, wasn't widespread until roughly 1200. 1200 is one of my favorite years of history. I say the magical year of 1200 BCE. For some reason, and we'll talk about this at length later, there were the collapse of a ton of Bronze Age civilizations, like the Mycenaeans, who are in mainland Greece, the Hittites, who are in Anatolia in the Middle East. Anatolia is present-day Turkey. And so because there was this wave of civilizations that actually collapsed, it ushered in a dark age in much of history, particularly with the Greeks. So when you think of Homer and the Trojan War, this would have been around the time of the Iron Age, the beginning, around that year 1200 BCE or so, we think. So my question for you, and one that I'd like you to do for homework and comment on the Google Classroom thread, is, so if we know the prehistoric era's end when written records begin, which is, roughly 550s BCE, then this would be during the times of the ancient civilizations, like the Greeks would have been around in the 550s BCE, right? But if you were to name the age that we live in currently, what would it be? And so again, I'd like you to comment on a Google Classroom thread. And just in case you're wondering, this is where all of my information was taken. Thanks, guys.